Hey everybody, my name is Kevin Derendorf. I run a blog called Mazer Patrol, and I have a book that I wrote called Kaiju for Hipsters. And I hope everybody's been enjoying Kaiju Con-Line and hearing about all sorts of really cool kaiju movies, because for the next hour or so, we're going to talk about specifically not kaiju movies. And I know that that's something that it might sound completely ridiculous to do at a kaiju convention, because there's the aphorism that Godzilla fans don't really watch anything else, and well, maybe we should. Now the question is, why would we want to watch non-kaiju movies? Well, first of all, if we're completists and we really want to see everything, there are little appearances here and there that aren't part of the 36 canonical Godzilla movies. And these are usually not long appearances. So if you're just going through with a stopwatch, like, oh, if he's not on screen for 25% of the movie, it's not worth watching, I'd say that you're probably not going to get a whole lot out of these movies. But if you're one of those people that, when it comes to like how many appearances has Varan had, well, he was in Destroy All Monsters. These appearances are probably on par with those, at least. And then the other reason, which I think is a little bit broader, is that, sometimes it's worthwhile to branch out into other movies, stuff that's not a kaiju film. And that can be a hard, scary transition to make a lot of the time. But if you're watching a non-kaiju movie and it has a kaiju in it, then, maybe you can have a little bit of an extra incentive to check out this other stuff. So as a note, I'm going to try to highlight the movies that I talk about here, with whether they have a U.S. release or not, with these American flags or no American flag. And, we want to get into why it might be worthwhile to check out some of these movies. So, like, for an example that's not Godzilla related, we have Citizen Kane, which is widely considered the greatest movie ever made. And it's not necessarily considered the greatest movie ever made because there's pterodactyls flying around in the background. But, if pterodactyls are what gets you to watch Citizen Kane, awesome. It did a good job. So if you've seen one of my panels before, you know that we go through a lot of content, and we just can't cover every single appearance. So I know somebody's going to at me with on Big Bang Theory, somebody got called a bridezilla and you didn't bring it up. And it's like, okay, we're not gonna talk about everything, but there are extensive lists online that you can go through for sightings and appearances, and you can really just go through wide range of content there. So we won't talk about everything, but there are examples out there. I want to try to focus on the ones that are the most interesting, the most significant, and have some sort of interesting relationship to the franchise or canon or whatever. So one of the things that I think is interesting is the way that characters show up a lot of the times for these minor appearances in American media versus in Japanese media. And that comes down to, and don't take this as legal advice because I'm not a lawyer, but in the US there are fair use exceptions for using characters in a parody, but in Japan there's not. So you can get away with a lot of stuff in the US that in Japan you basically have to rely on not getting sued in order to publish it. So as an example, we have a famous example that people bring up all the time for a Godzilla appearance in media, which is from The Simpsons in 30 Minutes Over Tokyo. And there's a whole lot of stuff in this episode because it's The Simpsons Go to Japan, and it's one of two episodes of The Simpsons that is never actually aired in Japan. That could be because there's some insensitivity about the way the Japanese emperor is depicted, but what a more common explanation is that they used the Hello Kitty trademark in the episode without permission, and it got pulled from Japanese distribution for that reason. On a more recent example, Mr. Osamatsu, the first episode, was completely pulled because it had a bunch of pop culture references that seemed like very clear parody content to me that in the US would be non-issues, but because it's Japan, the publishers could look at it and just say, no, we don't like the way that you're depicting X property. It shouldn't be allowed on air. So it got basically removed from streaming sites. It hasn't been released on home video. It just aired the one time. So you can kind of see a little bit of this difference throughout Japanese media. And there are a couple of cases when you look at differences between the US and Japan. You know, in the scene in Shinesman, one of the characters puts on a kaiju costume. In the English dub, she says specifically that it's a Godzilla suit, but that's not part of the Japanese original. Or in Super Monster Gamera, when a poster gets knocked down, it's Dojira, it's not Gojira. So it's trying to obfuscate it a little bit. Whereas if you look at Craw the Sea Monster, he just goes ahead and tears through a giant Godzilla poster. I even like, on a very meta level, the scene in Deep Sea Monster Eiga. There's some Americans that point up at the monster and say, oh, it's Godzilla. And then the Japanese quickly hush them about it because it's kind of a joke about how litigious the studios could possibly get. So because of this, a lot of these examples that you get American fandom like jumping on are like, oh, this is a great cameo that Godzilla has made in media that was unauthorized, has actually not been distributed in Japan. And it's funny just sort of going through lists of shows. A lot of them have not been distributed at all, or the season in question hasn't been distributed. But you know, there are cases like that Simpsons episode that was specifically pulled. That's not to say that the Japanese don't occasionally have these little cameos. They certainly do, and they're just as ubiquitous, but they tend to be relatively short when they do show up, as to not get on too many toes. They tend to really just have sort of blink and you'll miss it appearances, with a few exceptions here or there. One of the exceptions that I like to bring up is Prefectural Earth Defense Force, which is a comedy series about alien invaders that basically decide to invade a small prefecture in Japan. And there's this gag in it where the main character has a flashback, Family Guy cutaway style, to how her father died. And it just plays the scene in Varan the Unbelievable where Varan eats a flare and blows up. So it's kind of a joke that it implies that her father was this giant monster. But I think it's interesting that this OVA has actually not ever been released on DVD in Japan. It's only available there on VHS and Laserdisc. In the US, it has a DVD release. So if you happen to have a copy of it, maybe hold on to it, because it could be very valuable. So one of the high-profile cases where Toho has actually gone after somebody and sued them was for Pee-wee's Big Adventure, because this is a madcap comedy, basically, about this character Pee-wee, who goes around getting into various hijinks situations. I would recommend watching it if you haven't. But there's a scene where he's riding his bicycle through a movie studio, and he just rides his bike through a scene where Godzilla and King Ghidorah are fighting each other. And that was something that Toho went after them for including, and they settled it out of court. So it wasn't, the movie is still available, but it was well publicized. What I think is interesting is that this movie was directed by Tim Burton, and he later went through official channels and licensed some Godzilla footage for an appearance in his comedy Mars Attacks, in which there's a scene where a bunch of aliens are sitting around watching disaster footage on television, including the scene from Godzilla vs. Biollante. Now, it probably helps that Tim Burton was well recognized by the time Mars Attacks came out, whereas when Pee-wee's Big Adventure was being made, he was not as big a name, and he's been very vocal about his fandom of Japanese monsters and has appeared alongside Godzilla and an Ultra Kaiju when he's visited Japan. That's not the only time that Godzilla's shown up in something as people watching it on a screen, though. It's actually a very common trope. And you see this with a lot of Japanese movies that were distributed by Toho, and I think part of it is it's a great sense of flavor when you're doing a period piece. So the earliest example of Godzilla making an appearance like this that I'm aware of is in Jurinko Chie, or Chie the Brat, which is directed by Isao Takahata. This is a movie that's not, when it was made, it was not considered part of the Studio Ghibli catalog, but after the fact has been included in Studio Ghibli sets, even though it's not available as part of anything that's been released in the US. So this was just kind of a comedy. Isao Takahata is really into Japanese culture in a way of, and sort of going through the Japanese experience, whether it's movies like Grave of the Fireflies or My Neighbor the Yamadas, or Pompoko. He is very into sort of period pieces and sort of showing a changing dynamic Japan as well. So that's kind of what's going on here, is that you have this this film that was set in 1967, even though it was made in 1981, and you have, of course, the main character go to a movie theater, and it was actually followed up by a TV series, which also has a Godzilla cameo in one of the dream sequences. So another movie where you actually get a scene involving somebody seeing Son of Godzilla in a movie theater is in 20th Century Boys, which is based on a thriller by Naoki Urasawa. And this is a very interesting sequence, because I guess it was chosen because of the time period that it was set in. 20th Century Boys is a science fiction series. It's actually, the trilogy is the most expensive thing that Toho has ever created at the time. And the idea is that you have kids that grew up in the 60s and 70s, and then in the modern day, the games that they played are becoming real. So they had this whole plot point about one of the games that they played was, oh, what if somebody was unleashing a killer virus in the year 2000, and then when they grow up, that comes to pass, and then the characters are trying to remember their childhoods of, well, what happened? How did all of these things that we made up as children come real? Which one of us is actually responsible for it? We find out that the main character's sister was the one who developed the virus, and there's a scene where he and his sister had gone to see Son of Godzilla as children, and then later on, her niece finds a note from the sister that said, I've become Godzilla, I've trampled hundreds of people to death. Now, I think it's a funny juxtaposition that Son of Godzilla is not a movie about Godzilla trampling hundreds of people to death, but it was still sort of selected, I think, because of how the timeline lines up. Similarly, you got a sort of dualism between the characters in the movie Sayonara Jupiter, which is a space opera directed by Koji Hashimoto. There's a scene where one character is watching Ghidra the Three-Headed Monster on a TV or a space TV or something along those lines. And basically, as he's watching the movie, you cut to people who are protesting this space project that they have going on, where basically they are going to destroy the planet Jupiter. So you get a bunch of environmentalists out protesting against the scientists who are going to destroy the planet Jupiter, and it comes to like a violent conflict. And as this guy is watching Ghidra the Three-Headed Monster, you cut back and forth to clips of the protesters scuffling with the authorities there, and you get sounds from the movie bleeding over, and you get the sense of, oh, this is vicious combat going back and forth between the protesters and the authorities. And it's interesting to me that this is also made in the same year by the same director as Return of Godzilla. So this was a big Toho endeavor at the time, even though it didn't pan out so well in terms of critical reception or box office. Now, one that has turned out very well for critical reception and its influence and footprint is Urusei Yatsura, Beautiful Dreamer from 1984. So this is a second movie that's a tie-in to a TV series. Urusei Yatsura is a zany comedy, basically, about a guy who, through happenstance, winds up engaged to an alien princess. You don't necessarily have to know a whole lot about it to appreciate this movie, though, because the idea for the movie is basically that you have the guy and the alien and all of his classmates are putting on a school festival, and the day that they're preparing for the school festival gets repeated over and over again until they figure out that they're basically living in a false world. They're living in a dream. So this is something that a lot of people have said could have influenced things like Dark City and Groundhog Day and The Matrix. That's one of those things that I don't know for sure if that's been confirmed or not. It's just something that gets said a lot, but there are similarities there. There's a lot of sort of time looping stuff that came out in Japanese media after this movie came out. So I don't know how direct or indirect such an influence could have been. But as they're setting up for the school festival, they are doing all sorts of decorations that involve lots of Toho related props. So you can see up here, you get Mogura and the Gotengo with the Manda around it, and it looks like somebody dressed as an ex-Seijin here. And it's just a nonstop barrage of little pop culture references as they're getting ready for the school fair. And then once they figure out that, hey, this whole life is a dream, they goof off and they just have fun with life. And of course, that means that they go to see a Godzilla movie. This is the only one of the 6 Urusei Yatsura movies that was actually produced with Toho. And because they had that connection to Toho, they're like, hey, we should make the most of it. Let's put a scene where they watch this Godzilla movie in it. And the producers at Toho were actually pretty thrilled to have them do this. Because of the time when this was made, unfortunately, they didn't really have easy access to the movie on video. So they really made the sequences where they're watching the movie up from memory. Now, if you're a fan of kaiju stuff, I would recommend checking out Urusei Yatsura because it is loaded with little appearances like the types that we talked about before, as well as having the likes of Kazunori Ito and Shusuke Kaneko on the staff of it, as well as Mamoru Oshii, who directed the first 2 of the movies, and we'll actually bring it up again later in this presentation. Another scene that's a character going to see Godzilla in the theater, sort of giving a sense of the cultural perception of the time, is in the movie Persepolis. This is based on a autobiography of a woman who grew up in Iran, and the movie is made in French. But this is a very well received. It's a sort of dramedy. It's a life story. It's very touching and moving. It was nominated for an Academy Award. But what I think is interesting from the Godzilla perspective is Toho has a credit in the credits, but it is in a different font than the rest of the credits. And what I sort of suspect is that this movie was made in France, and then when it started moving out onto the international stage, Toho stepped in and said something along the lines of like, hey, we should be credited for the inclusion of Godzilla in this movie. And because this is an Oscar nominated, very well received critical darling, they didn't want to necessarily block it, but they wanted that credit in there. So would recommend. So we're out of sort of these people going to see Godzilla in the movies appearances, but there's all sorts of other little background appearances here and there. One of them is in the Adventures of Kosuke Kindaichi, or Kindaichi Kosuke no Boken. And this is directed by Nobuhiko Obayashi, who directed House. And this movie is completely zany. It is goofy and a comedy spoof of the Kindaichi mysteries that Toho has made actually a couple of adaptations of them before, such as the Vampire Moth and things like that. So this is just think about like the Zucker Brothers movies, like or spoofs like Naked Gun or Airplane, where it's just a rapid fire pop culture joke minute after minute after minute. So there's a couple of Toho related ones, this being a Toho movie. In addition to a great house gag, we have a scene where they go to a museum where the thieves are stealing all of the art, and you can see that they have a statue of Godzilla doing the thinker pose in the background at this art museum. There's another where you have the characters is looking into suspicious people that they're seeing around, and you get a little cameo by the lead from two of Toho's Dracula movies, just showing up as Dracula because it's a gag and people would have recognized that in the 70s. Another comedy is All About Our House. This is a fun little piece where basically it's a husband and wife are getting married and they're getting this house built for themselves. And they have an idea of what it's going to be like, and the wife's father is basically a contractor. Like he has a bunch of experience, and they have conflicts between him and the architect who wants to go with a much more modern, fancy idea for the house, and then also the husband's mom is one of those people that's really into feng shui, and then you have the city council has their own ideas. So the idea is that with this movie, it's them just trying to get their house built, but everybody has these competing ideas about what should be done with it. And there's a recurring gag throughout the series throughout the movie. Our main character works in a screenwriting position. So he's always trying to think about how this one scene should go in the movie, where you have a bunch of people crowded outside of a door, and they're trying to get in, and somebody will come bursting through the door. So of course, we have the gag here early on in the movie, where you have Godzilla is bursting through the door, and it's a big surprise to everyone there. And what they eventually settle on in the wrapped project is, you can see at the bottom of the screen, what actually winds up coming through the door in the finished movie is Megaguirus. So I guess they didn't get too far off from that. And then of course in the cast party, you just have a guy in a Godzilla suit hanging out with everyone as they're enjoying the new completed house together. Another little Godzilla-ish appearance is in Crayon Shin-chan. There's a gag in Shin-chan where he has a Godzilla figure that he has replaced the tail, because the tail is broken off, with the butt from a baby doll. And in the movie Crayon Shin-chan Buri Buri 3 Minutes Charge, there's actually a scene where he has a dream sequence where this version, the Shiri Marudashi Godzilla, comes in and attacks his house. This movie is great because it's got a lot more kaiju related stuff in it throughout. And just in case you're one of those people that's like, oh, I really need to have every Godzilla figure that's ever been made, it's out there. Shin-chan is an interesting franchise because it's one of those it's basically like a Japanese equivalent of Family Guy or The Simpsons, where it's been around forever, and you get the main character is this little rude 5-year-old who gets into all sorts of amusing antics. So he actually did cross over with Shin Godzilla in an episode where he defeats him by plugging up his mouth with his butt, and he's met Kamen Rider a few times. So it's a wacky, goofy little. I would say kids show. The US dub sort of punches it up a little bit, but it's quite an experience, and kind of a core part of the Japanese pop culture. So you'll see like whole dedicated Shin-chan stores in Japan and the like. Another appearance that I think a lot of people are going to be familiar with is in Always Sunset on 3rd Street Part 2. This is the sequel, as you might guess, to Always Sunset on 3rd Street. I know a lot of people only watch the beginning of the second movie because there's a dream sequence where Godzilla shows up, but I would wholeheartedly recommend watch this entire trilogy. The first movie swept the Japanese Academy Awards. The second one was nominated for Best Picture. And they're basically just dramas about a neighborhood, the 3rd Street neighborhood, as you might guess, in the Showa, in around 1950, going into the 60s. And you can kind of measure time as Tokyo Tower is being built in the background, but you get little bits of pop culture, including this Godzilla appearance, which was a total surprise when it came up in the theaters for audiences, that you would open it up with a Godzilla rampage. Now, another appearance that's a little bit more publicized is a brief appearance in the first of the My Hero Academia movies. So My Hero Academia is a superhero franchise where it's like X-Men, where lots of characters have distinct powers that they call quirks. So somebody might have a quirk that is explosion, so they can create explosions, and somebody might have a quirk that's ice, so they can create ice. And you're introduced to a hero briefly, and then the montage of heroes in this movie. The hero's named Godzilla, and his quirk is Godzilla. So his superpower is that he is Godzilla. The creator of My Hero Academia is actually a bit of a kaiju nerd. So we get little bits and pieces here and there with like this intro splash page for the manga that's a parody of Mothra. And then actually on April Fool's Day, when they were announcing the second movie, they did a parody Godzilla poster for that movie as well. And a lot of people say that the one of the villains in the second movie, who is this invincible monster guy that can breathe fire and is kind of like a beast, is also Godzilla inspired. But I think you don't get really more on the nose than Godzilla. So it's hard to top that. Another Toho film with a little cameo appearance is Weathering with You. So if you'll remember, in 2016, Toho was not doing that great financially going into the year, but they managed to turn it around and make quite a hefty profit because of two movies. One of them was Shin Godzilla, and the other was a film called Your Name. So the director of Your Name, Makoto Shinkai, was going to all these award shows, and he'd always be going to these shows with Ano and Taguchi, or with a Godzilla suit next to him. So I suspect that had something to do with when the sequel to Your Name came out, which, by the way, you don't actually have to see Your Name before seeing Weathering with You, but you should, because it's an amazing movie. He put a little scene where they go to a comic festival, and there's a Godzilla cosplayer sort of wandering through the background of one of the shots. I think that this is a fun one to point out, that this movie features the Shinjuku Gracery, Godzilla, massive urban destruction, and a giant creature, but none of those things are actually on screen at the same time. Another little fun appearance is in City Hunter Shinjuku Private Eyes. So this is a revival of a series from the 80s that's about sort of a hard-boiled PI / sweeper who goes and he fights various crimes around Shinjuku. So when they did a revival movie just last year, the Shinjuku landscape has changed a little bit, which plays into things here and there. But one of the newest, most identifiable features in this Shinjuku neighborhood of Tokyo now is the Godzilla Hotel. And there's this big Godzilla bust that roars on the hour. So the way that they kind of showed that this movie was modernized is that there's an opening chase sequence where there's terrorists that are driving a street through Shinjuku with driving through the street with a rocket launcher. And this is not accurate to how Japan is in real life, by the way. But they lose control and they fire their missile, and it's heading right towards the Godzilla statue until our main character shoots the missile out of the air with his 357 Magnum. So yes, the main character in City Hunter has saved Godzilla from being blown up. I think a lot of people would already know about Ready Player One because that was a big, high-profile American movie from director Steven Spielberg. But this is one that I think is definitely one of the better known minor appearances, and this is not technically Godzilla either. This is Mechagodzilla that shows up in it. Basically, this is set in a VR world where people are going in and they're playing online virtual games that sort of they have their avatars that are all based on popular culture. So you have characters, driving the car from Back to the Future or riding the bike from Acura. And the original novel had a lot of references to 80s pop culture, including this big climax where the main character pilots Leopardon from the Japanese Spider-Man, and then he turns into Ultraman, and he fights with Kiryu at the end. But all of that was apparently not good in terms of the licensing and legal disputes regarding characters like Ultraman or the Valkyries from Super Dimension Fortress Macross. And as a result, a lot of these things got replaced in the movie. But you still have King Kong show up. You have a Gundam from Mobile Suit Gundam and the Iron Giant. But what I think we're most interested in is the villain takes the form of Mechagodzilla. It's a brand new Mechagodzilla design that was created just for this movie. Now, as we're talking about crazy pop culture mashups, there's another movie from last year. Yes, it's from last year. I don't care what comicbook.com says about the quote upcoming Godzilla anime. This is the Shinkalion movie. So Shinkalion is a series that's very Japanese, in case you're wondering why it hasn't been broadcast simultaneously or brought over to the US. It's a kids show about transforming robots, but the transforming robots are all based on Shinkansen bullet trains that are ubiquitous in Japan and a big part of the culture. So the idea is that you have, monsters show up and the various bullet trains transform into robots to fight them. Over the course of the TV series, they go through lots of different bullet trains that exist in Japan, but there's also a bullet train that is based on the TV series Neon Genesis Evangelion. So, of course, they have an episode where it's an Evangelion crossover where the Evangelion train transforms into an Evangelion robot. And in Japan, there's a train based around the virtual pop idol Hatsune Miku. So there's an episode where the Miku train transforms and it is piloted by Hatsune Miku. So it's a bit of a pop culture mashup anyway. But then you get into this movie where Godzilla is in it as one of the minor antagonists in the film. So you get to see the Vocaloid Hatsune Miku piloting a robot and get beat up by this snow Godzilla. If this Godzilla model looks familiar, it's actually reused from an amateur movie contest that Toho had a few, I guess it was maybe 2 years ago or so. If you've been watching the Gojiban shorts, the puppet shows on YouTube, that was part of the same contest. But there is this Godzilla versus Gigan short that was entered, G versus G, and they basically said that they wanted to work with the guy that did the models for that CGI short, and they recycled that model and they put it right into their professional movie. So it's not only Godzilla that has these little cameos and things here and there. So if we want to segue a little bit, if we look at, say, the rest of the Toho catalog, you can see a lot of them in this movie, Awamori-kun Kanpai, or Cheers, Mr. Awamori. This is a second in a series of musical comedies, and they're these goofy things starring the musician Kyu Sakamoto, who just gets into various hijinks. The first of the Awamori movies actually was on double bill with the original Mothra. This one was on double bill with The Last War. And there's a sequence in this movie where Awamori sneaks into Toho Studios and watches them filming parts of The Last War. So you get these, like, you see, Frankie Sakai and company doing their Last War scenes. And then if you're an audience member in Japan, you would see these same scenes happening in the actual movie when you're watching it on the double feature. And I think that is just wild and really cool. But on top of that, there's a bit where he wanders into the props department, and he gets all freaked out because there's all of these different props from the different monster movies that had taken place, really except Godzilla, because you have Mothra and Varan and Mogra and the Buddha from Devil in the Castle and the Notaro from Battle in Outer Space and the Orochi from Birth of Japan. So it's just a lot of fan service there if you want to just go through and a freeze frame and see ooh, that's this proper. And it's a cool behind the scenes look into these movies as well, because you don't necessarily get when you're watching the movies as presented properly sort of how stuff was stored or what scale things actually were. Another behind the scenes look is in the TV series Hiya the Sun from 1967, or Taiyo no Aitsu. So the second episode of this series, the series is about a reporter who just kind of goes around doing public interest stories and interviews interesting people. And in this episode, you see a bit where Haru Nakajima actually gets a little role as kind of himself. He's playing a character that's like a fictionalized version of himself, but you get these scenes behind the scenes with Gaira wrestling against Kira from Ultraman, which obviously never happened in reality, but then it leads into this wild boxing match thing where Gaira fights a boxer, and I haven't been able to track this down, so it's kind of a hearsay from episode descriptions that have been made available, but I'd love to see this come out as a box set of some sort. Another brief appearance that if you watch my anime panel a couple years ago, we play this whole clip at the end of the sixth episode of Nurse Witch Komugi. There's a wild scene where they play the march from Battle in Outer Space, where they basically have a whole lot of different Japanese landmarks transform and fight against the alien invaders. Including the bit where a mountain cracks open in Okinawa and King Caesar comes out, and it's all set to that great classic Ifukube music. It's hilarious. So I would recommend Nurse Witch Komugi. It's a magical girl show. I should specify this is the OVA version. It's not the recent TV remake of it. But it's really. It's one of those referential, goofy anime comedies. A lot more sort of gratuitous, licensed or potentially unlicensed music has popped up. The movie Tokyo, I think, is on a lot of people's radars recently. That's an anthology where you have sort of three chapters throughout it. The first of which is from Michel Gondry, and the third is from recent Academy Award-winning Junho Bong, but the middle section is from Leo Kurai, and I was very confused for a long time after I watched this movie, because the entire short uses music from the original Godzilla, but thematically it didn't feel like it really fit in with the original Godzilla. It's about this French guy that comes to Japan, and he's really awful because he's French, I guess. but it plays the Godzilla music as he's going through his rampages. So I did some looking into it, and it turns out that the director actually hated the original Godzilla movie, but he took the music from it for a short anyway. So that's a little disappointing. Another high-profile example is from Glee episode 33, which is one of the highest-rated TV broadcasts of all time because it came on right after the Super Bowl. And this has a sequence where this coach for this high school cheerleading team brings out a big cannon because she wants a spectacular show for the football game. And when she brings it out, it plays the theme from Godzilla vs. Destroyer. I can't tell if that's actually licensed music or not because it's not listed anywhere in the credits. I assume that they ran it by their legal department before they played it up. That music is still included in the versions that are streaming on Netflix, but it's a very short clip, so maybe it falls under the sort of the parody protection rules. You do get a lot of Toho music used in one of the episodes of Kimagure Orange Road. So Kimagure Orange Road is a romantic comedy that's about a teenager with the psychic powers, and he's in a love triangle. All of that is really sort of irrelevant for the 40th episode. The 40th episode is this kind of parody of Mothra and Top Gun. This isn't based on anything. This isn't based on anything that was in the original manga. This is purely something that was made up for the anime version because the anime version was made by Toho. So they used all of the Ifukube tracks that they could get their hands on for this episode, as they have this parody where the main character's cat grows giant and goes on a rampage. Similarly, the show Monster Musume, which is a very racy sort of harem series about all of these monster girls that are in love with one character. That anime was also made by Toho. And when they adapted one of the stories where the slime girl grows really large, they really Godzilla'd her up and gave her the sort of Godzilla back spines and a beam weapon that wasn't part of that original manga story either. The manga does have a character that is a, quote, Matango girl, which I think is kind of hilarious in the pantheon of monsters that you would not expect to be sort of sexualized in this nature. Speaking of racy outfits, that brings us to a movie series. There is actually two of these that were directed by Noriaki Yuasa as sort of his consolation prize for not getting to direct the Heisei Gamera reboot. So he did these two movies, Cosplay Senshi Cutie Night, which are basically magical girl direct-to-video movies. But, because he is the guy that is associated with Gamera, they evidently didn't have any problems with lending him the Gamera costume to have Gamera show up as a helper to our heroines in this in either of these two movies. So Gamera is sort of like a Pokemon in this, and that he's a capsule monster that when they're in trouble they throw down, and he emerges, and then he'll fight off the bad guys for them. Yuasa himself actually got into one of the monster suits in one of these in the second movie, playing one of the monsters actually from another show called Armor Jack. And the Gamera suit was really going around at this time because it actually also showed up in this short direct-to-video thing called Sailor Fight. Another little minor kaiju appearance is in Tora-san's Forbidden Love. Tora-san is a long-running comedy series that's about this kind of lovable loser that in every episode, every one of the movies, he falls in love with a new woman. And they just released a new movie last year, so it's a long-running thing. This is the 34th of them, and it's from 1984. The reason why this is his forbidden love is that he falls in love with a married woman in this movie. But the introduction to this movie is very similar to what you see in Always Sunset on 3rd Street, actually, that he has this dream sequence where Guilala emerges, and he uses his lucky charm to sort of vanquish Guilala. This is done mostly through stock footage from the original X from Outer Space from 1967, but you get a little bit of new Guilala footage here and there. This was also definitely a spoof on Return of Godzilla, which is a big deal at the time. So they kind of were using this as a, this is a Shochiku movie. We can't quite include Godzilla, but Shochiku's kind of default kaiju when they need a kaiju is Guilala. And you actually see a lot of Guilala showing up in different things here and there, such as in Boys Be Ambitious from 1996, which is kind of like a young punk, young thugs movie. It's actually, there was a series of movies called Young Thugs that this was a first entry in, kind of. There's a monster sequence in Bad News Bears Go to Japan where a kid fights against a monster that's not exactly Guilala, but in some of the stock footage, it's clearly Guilala that's stomping on the buildings. And then, with the Monster X Strikes Back, Guilala also fought the superhero Dennis, sort of. Speaking of zany comedies, we have Cromartie High School, the movie, which is just about a bunch of delinquent thugs who are in a high school. They get into all sorts of crazy situations. You can see their class includes like a robot and a gorilla and a guy that looks like Freddie Mercury. So it's really slapstick and goofy. Towards the climax of this movie, an alien ship just comes down, and Dr. Gory and Law from Spectre Man come out, and they are our main characters, being high school thugs, are completely unimpressed with them, and they basically don't make too much of an impact. So I think a lot of people know about the movie Death Kappa. It's not very popular, I know, but it's the suit in it from Tomo Hariguchi is actually not invented for the movie Death Kappa. It has a long sort of circuitous history to it, where it was, as far as I can tell, it first shows up on screen in the movie Kibakichi in 2004, which is a werewolf samurai film. And then after that, it shows up in this sitcom about a family that lives in a grudge house, from the movie The Grudge, which is a house that attracts all sorts of evil spirits and including yokai. So the same Kappa costume shows up in that as well. So Death Kappa is actually the fourth outing of that particular costume. So it's holding up relatively well at that point. Speaking of costumes that really kind of get around, you had this costume that shows up in the movie Hollywood Boulevard, called Godzilla, and somehow that one wound up in the possession of John Belushi, and wound up being used on Saturday Night Live, but also in the NBC broadcast of Godzilla vs. Megalon. So no footage of that broadcast exists, but the fact that this was sort of an unofficial costume that was then used in official promotion puts it into a really interesting place when you think about like how officially should we be looking at this thing at this point, similarly to the CGI Godzilla that was reused for Shinkalion. Speaking of things with a weird semi-officiality, there's a sketch comedy show called What a Fantastic Night, which if you've been one of those people that's been shipping Godzilla and Mothra after a certain Michael Dougherty movie, you're not the first, because there was a sketch on that called Mojira no Gyakushu, which is basically a spoof on kaiju movies with this child of Godzilla and Mothra that's running amok. And this sketch is interesting because it's got Akihiko Hirata in his final kaiju performance, as well as Yoshiko Tanaka in her first. And the climax of this is that this monster fights against this guy in the sunglasses here, Tamori, who's sort of the host of What a Fantastic Night, and he's all decked out as another kaiju. So it's a trip. That wasn't Tamori's only appearance on What a Fantastic Night as a monster character. He also appeared as this character in a series of sketches called Daima Jinko. And all of this is using the, Ifukube music and everything. So the just kind of lighthearted gag pieces around the Daimajin concept. What I think is really fun is that when Tokyo: The Last Megalopolis came out, your villain in that, Kyusaku Shimada's character, Kato, is known as Majin, or the Demon Man. So they had a Majin meets Majin sketch where Daimajin Ko actually met up with Kato, and it's Shimada in his full costume. It's a cross promotion for that movie. Some more comedy characters that have made some appearances. We have Kamen Norida and Ultraman Zearth, who both appeared on Tunnels no Minasan no Okage Des, which is sort of like thanks to all those in the tunnels. Both of these characters started out as goofy sketch comedy characters and then were incorporated into later official works, which is fun. Speaking of Ultraman, Ultraman showed up on the Toei series Shushutrion as kind of a guest star. They go to Tsuburaya Productions and meet a bunch of kaiju there. Shushutrion is a magical girl series through Toei. I think it's sort of fun that Toei and Tsuburaya were so willing to work with each other at the time. But if you look at, this is the same time that Ultraman versus Kamen Rider was made, so it's not that outlandish to think about. There's also the Indonesian children's sitcom Upin Ipin. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I don't speak any of that language. But there's this Ultraman character, Ultraman Reboot, who's shown up in 2 major story arcs. This character has recently been put into the live action shorts that they've been doing on YouTube for the Ultra fight. So this is another one of those like little minor characters that has been sort of incorporated into larger canon as it goes forward. And Ultraman's shown up in some other stuff as well. There's some episodes of Wooser's hand-to-mouth life, where this little goofy rabbit creature who lives on the internet meets up with several of the Ultraman monsters and things. And Wooser actually makes a cameo in SSSS Gridman because of that. And we've got also our movie series made in China that recently Tsuburaya won a big landmark case against, is these Dragon Force films. So Dragon Force is a superhero franchise about sort of like a Power Rangers is team of heroes that transform, but they licensed the character of Ultraman from UM Corporation, who did not actually have the rights to Ultraman, but they intended to make 6 movies featuring the character, and they only got to about 3 of them before they were completely shut down. But these things exist, and they're kind of weird. It's not just Ultraman that they're kind of liberally cribbing in these movies. They are using sound effects from Godzilla 2014, and there's shots that are completely lifted from Pacific Rim in them as well. So I'm glad that they exist, but they're kind of like a little bit problematic on multiple levels. Several of the Ultra Brothers showed up on episodes of Comet-chan. Comet-chan was kind of like a sort of a Bewitched or I Dream of Jeannie type of show, where it's a girl from space who has magical powers. But they had little guest appearances by the different Ultras as the series went along. A more fun little appearance that I think is fantastic is on Takeshi's Castle. There's several episodes where the Ultra Brothers and various monsters show up. Takeshi's Castle is a game show where people go through a lot of obstacles. It was re-edited kind of not so well as the show called MXC for the US. But Yeah, it's basically an obstacle course. Characters get eliminated as they go along. So if you want to see some of the episodes with the Ultra Monsters wiping out hilariously in their sort of unwieldy costumes, I would recommend checking those out. And it's hosted by the great Takashi Kitano. So. That brings us to perhaps the weirdest of the Ultraman cameos that I've come across here is Mina Agachao, which was directed by Shusuke Kaneko, and this is early Shusuke Kaneko. So if you know what Shusuke Kaneko was up to in his early days, you will know that he was into pink films or erotic comedies at Nikatsu. So yeah, he managed to somehow convince Tsuburaya to allow him to use the Ultra Mother in the opening scene of this softcore pornographic film. And then towards the end of it, there's a scene where the main character has some sexy times with a kaiju. Apparently, Kaneko originally wanted to use Gamera for the climax of the film, so to speak, and Daiei was not so happy with that. And I'm sort of surprised that they came back to him to do an official Gamera movie after that proposal. You can see part of this movie on YouTube because at least the Ultraman scenes were re-edited into a movie in Hong Kong called Always Yours. We're going a little short on time here, so I'll try to blast through a few things as we get to our end. You'll see a lot of collaborations where you have unrelated movies promoted across the board with Japan. So you'll see Godzilla in sort of crossover posters and things like that. It's not just Godzilla that happens for. You'll see the same thing with Ultraman, Gundam, Attack on Titan, Mazinger, etc., etc. There's a handful of other little Godzilla appearances that somehow slipped under the radar, so to speak. The people would probably get mad at me if I didn't bring up the Bambi versus Godzilla cartoon. I think is an interesting one because that was made without any licensing, either for Bambi or for Godzilla, but became such a piece of cult media that it was actually attached to the opening of Godzilla 1985 when it got its US release. Interestingly, it was not attached to a Godzilla movie in Japan, but it was attached to Attack of the Giant Leeches. So that's your fun trivia for today. A couple of, as far as I can tell, completely unsanctioned appearances that I think are worth mentioning. You have Gamera shows up in many episodes of Dragon Ball as this character, Baby Gamera, who the character Master Roshi rides around on. So, this martial art wizard who is turtle-based, has a Gamera that he rides around on. I've never seen any Dragon Ball stuff reference the fact that Gamera is not one of their characters. They continually merchandise this character, and I guess just because it's like the biggest, hottest anime franchise in the universe, nobody cares. Similar deal with there's a whole episode of Urusei Yatsura where Lum buys a Daimajin and brings it to school with her, and again, there's no reference to this being a product that is owned by Daiei Corporation, but again, because it's 1985, I think maybe Tokuma just was not that invested, as a comparison point. If you look at Ultraman Max, they had a brief scene where Godzilla and Gamera toys are on screen, and then they had to cut that out for the DVD version. So they've definitely changed as a company. You get a bunch of stuff as stock footage, but we're just about at time. So on that note, I think we'll just wrap it up for the panel. And thank you all for viewing. It's been a fun time. I'll let you guys get to the next presentation by Kyle and company.